Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing this portrait of Gamgee, a character from the Lord of the Rings. I'm going to be using colored pencils on sandpaper, and it's going to be a challenging drawing, so let's see how it goes. If you're wondering about the paper, I'm going to be using a waterproof 1000 grit sandpaper. You can buy this at any hardware store. Works pretty well with pastels and colored pencils. I'm going to be using Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils for the most part, but if you catch me using some other brand, it's because I didn't have a specific color that I wanted. So I have a limited number of colors, but I'm going to make do with what I have. And I'm starting with a sketch, but in case you're wondering how I established the proportions, first I used a tracing method for some of the basic proportions, such as the positioning of the eyes and the nose and things like that. And after that I am doing a more elaborate, more detailed sketch using multiple colors, using my colored pencils. I'm drawing the outline of the head and drawing some of the darker areas in between the bangs and the forehead. And the left side of the body and the robe is going to be a bit lighter because the light source is coming more from the left. So the right side is going to be the shadow side. I also use some of my darker pencils here to draw some more of the details around the eyes, to draw the shape of the eyes. And I'm not going to do much more with the sketch, just a few details here and there using a couple of different colored pencils. That's going to be good enough to start with. After that I'm going to work on the background a little bit. This is going to be a challenging drawing for me because even though this is a very interesting technique and there are many advantages, I haven't really practiced doing portraits in it, so we'll see how it goes. I want to draw a blurry background, out of focus background with some lights and suggestions of some shapes in the background. I'm going to be using a combination of these lighter colored pencils for the lights and some of the darker colored pencils, including the dark green, the dark olive green, and some black for the darker areas. And I'm going to be blending this nicely to avoid having too much texture and to create a bokeh background that doesn't have any specific shapes but just some suggestions of shapes and lights in the background. I want to make this look like a scene maybe in the forest where the light is coming through the branches, it's coming through the trees. So I'm going to have some darker and dark green and dark brown maybe tones as well, but I'm going to have some lighter and yellowish tones for those lights. For the lighter details here I used an ivory colored pencil and a white colored pencil, but for the darkest bits I'm just using a plain black colored pencil. Now it's important for me to do a good part of the background here on the left side of the drawing because I want to have a nice contrast with my main subject and I want to be able to define the left side of my main subject. I also put in some bluish details to maybe make it look like some of the sky is coming through. I used a phthalo blue, but it's going to be modified quite a bit by blending. It's going to get a little bit darker and I don't mind. I wanted it to be darker and blurrier anyway. So brushes are useful here because they're allowing me to move the color around a little bit and make everything a little bit more blurry and less defined. Now the reason why tortillons and brushes work so well on with colored pencils on sandpaper is because it's easier to move the pigment on sandpaper than it is on regular paper. On regular paper you couldn't really do a lot of the things that I'm doing now with colored pencils. Trying some of these techniques on regular paper would be really frustrating and it wouldn't work at all. So you can see I made some progress with the left side of the background, and it's looking like an out of focus background. That's probably good enough. I'm just putting down some of the finishing touches to this part of the drawing and refining it a little bit before I move on to my main subject. Now the portrait itself is going to be the trickiest part, obviously, because the hair is kind of messy with a lot of overlapping bangs and strands of hair and segments of hair. And there's also colors and tones to worry about as well. So this is way more complex than working in charcoal, where I mostly work in black and white most of the time. But I'm also working on a new medium. I haven't really tried doing portraits on sandpaper, so we'll see how it goes. Now for some of these lighter hairs, flyaway hairs, I'm going to be using this light peach color. I believe this is a Stadler one, because I didn't have anything similar in the Faber-Castell range, so I just picked this one up. And it's kind of a light yellowish peachy color. I added some yellowish and some ochre tones to that as well. Now for the darker bits between the segments of hair, between these lighter segments of hair, I'm going to be adding some browns, different browns, like burnt umber, walnut brown maybe, a burnt sienna, which is like a reddish brown, and even black here and there. So right now I'm defining those darker areas in between the segments of hair, trying to give the hair a bit more depth and structure, because that too needs to look more three-dimensional, so I need to have a range of value there as well. I also started working on the face, on the skin tone, using this cinnamon color, then putting some ochre on top of it. Now blending, using the blending tools is going to modify the colors considerably every time you do it, and that's something you need to take into account. But if you feel like you don't like the color you're getting, you just put down some more on top, and that normally works. I find that in most cases brushes work a little bit better than tortillons when blending on sandpaper, but tortillons have their advantages and they have their uses. I'm going to be using this ochre, burnt ochre, for most of the hair, for like a base color for the hair, because his hair, I believe, is kind of yellowish brown, or at least that's the way it looks here. So that's the tone that I'm going to try to achieve. I also added some very dark details in between some of these segments of hair, using a brown and a black. I have no problem using black for darker areas. It seems to work pretty well on sandpaper. You can easily add some other tones on top of it while retaining the amount of value. I'm going to have some of these lighter details, these smaller lights in the background here at the top of the paper as well. Some more of that blurry background. And I'm going to do a bit more of that background above his head, so that I could define some of the lighter hairs on the top of his head. So it's very important how the main subject interacts with the background. So I have to do a good portion of the background first, so that I could proceed with the main part of the drawing. And of course, I'm still using the brushes a lot for blending. I'm mostly using hard bristle brushes. Adding some dark green and yellowish tones And now I'm going to put in a little bit more work on this here. And the good thing about colored pencils is that you can work from light to dark, but also from dark to light, which will prove very, very useful here when working on his hair, because his hair is very complex. It's kind of curly and messy, and these bangs and flyaway hairs are flying every which way, and they kind of overlap, and I need to be able to show that depth and that complexity of the hair. So to do that, it's very useful to be able to draw from dark to light, because then I can draw some of the darker areas first and then add these lighter segments on top. So that's exactly what I'm going to do with this lightest pencil that I used so far. I'm going to add some flyaway hairs around the edges, but I'm also going to add some highlights on some of these segments of hair which are lying on top of the others. So how should I explain this? Because the hair, you can't draw every single hair, obviously. You have to kind of try to group these hairs into segments, and some of these segments are going to be deeper in the shadow, and there's going to be other segments lying on top of them. Well, those that are on top are going to be lighter because they're going to be catching more light from above, and those that are below are hidden in the shadow under all that hair, and these are going to be darker. And drawing a few flyaway hairs here and there across these segments will also create a nice realistic effect, because that's just something you can do when you're able to work from dark to light. I even added a bit of ivory color pencil on top, which is an even lighter color, because I want the top part of the head to be the lightest, and I'm going to want to try to achieve a great deal of contrast between the left side and the right side, because like I said, the right side is going to be my shadow side. Here I decided to bring you in a little bit closer. I zoomed in a little bit so that you can see the details that I'm trying to put in. I'm working on the eyes, or rather on the eye on the left, and I'm going to be using a combination of black and brown color pencil for now, and naturally I'm going to have to work around that, drawing the skin but shading the eye socket as well. I'm going to be using a variety of colors to achieve a nice realistic looking skin tone, and honestly a lot of this is just going to be experimentation, because I'm not really an expert, and this is kind of a new medium for me, so I'm just kind of trying out different colors, trying to see if I can get the tones that I like. And of course I keep using my blending tools as well, and adding some other tones on top of the ones that I've already achieved. I'm going to use black for the darker part of these eyebrows, and a bit of brown for the rest. Naturally these eyeballs need to be shaded a little bit so that they too have some shape. I need to shade the whites of the eyes as well, as you can see, so that they're not completely white, and so that they're a little bit darker around the corners. So still experimenting a little bit with those color tone, or with those skin tones. I'm mostly using a combination of cinnamon and burnt ochre for now, and adding some other tones such as pink, then light peach for some of the lighter areas, and some browns and some reddish browns like the burnt sienna. The thing is that there is no right combination of colors for drawing skin, because the appearance of the skin always depends on the setting, it depends on the lighting. So the environment influences the appearance of both the skin and the hair. And here, as you can see, I'm kind of experimenting with a variety of different colors to see what makes most sense for me. He has fairly long hair, long bangs, so I need to incorporate that as well, and there's going to be a bit of shadow, a slightly darker area on that part of the forehead. But once I establish some of those basic tones on the skin, I always go in with that light peach color, which has worked pretty well for me so far, both for the hair and for the skin tones. Now, like I said, the right side of the face, or his left side of the face, is going to be a lot darker because of the light source, because that part of his face is facing away from the light source. And I'm freely going to use a lot of black for that part of the portrait. As I've already mentioned many times, I have no problem using black for the shadow areas. Some people advise against it. When I look at my references and I see something that kind of looks like black or pretty dark, I just use black, and I don't really care much about the rules. And another thing is that on this surface, on this medium, colors tend to blend a little bit better. So you can easily draw a shadow area, or shade a darker area using a black, and then add some other tones on top of it. It's not a problem at all. Now I'm working on his lips. I also used some other tones, such as some other colors, such as that Venetian red and some pink, and shading that area above the upper lip and below the lower lip. He has a peculiar looking mouth. I think he has a slight overbite, maybe, or that's how it appears to me. The character of Sam Gamgee was portrayed by Astin in the movie. He's one of my favorite actors. He has had roles in some pretty famous movies. Lord of the Rings is probably the most famous one. Now I'm using an ivory colored pencil for some of the stronger highlights on the nose and on the left side of the face. The idea, of course, is to create a range of value, a range between the lightest lights and the darkest darks, and if you achieve that range, then you'll be able to show shape and volume in your main subject. I felt like I needed some more pinkish tones around some areas, so I added a bit of that. And the neck is going to be a bit darker for the most part. So I'm slowly moving towards the other side of the face, the right side of the face, where things are going to be a little bit darker. Back to what I was saying about the actor. Obviously, my reference is based on a scene from a movie, so I wanted my drawing to have a good degree of likeness. I wanted him to look like the actor. I've already done many drawings based on both the movies and the book, and these are always interesting subjects to talk about, at least for me, but for many other people as well, because so many people have seen them. And if you haven't read the books, as always, I will advise you to go and read them, because the books are always better than the movie. And in this case, that's most certainly the case. So, Why was this drawing so challenging? Mostly because I'm not that great with colors, honestly. I'm going to admit that. Um, I do black and white drawings and black and white portraits far more often than I do colored ones, colored pencil ones. And the thing that makes things a bit more complicated for me is also that colored pencils behave a lot differently on this surface than they do on normal paper. So I'm used to doing a few commissions of colored pencil portraits here and there, mostly children. And these are not too complex, and I'm kind of used to working on regular paper. I mostly work on 200 GSM or 190 GSM smooth paper that I normally use for other types of pencils. But here, the colored pencils, they tend to behave a little bit differently. So in some ways they are more similar to pastel pencils because the material, the surface grinds down on the pencil, and it's easier to move around that pigment. Things are also just a little bit messier, but there are of course still some differences, obviously, because colored pencils are not as easily smudged even when you're working on sandpaper or sanded papers. Now if you want to try this technique on an artist quality sanded paper, if you can find one, that's great. I would suggest UArt because that's probably the most similar to this one. But what do I know? I mostly use cheaper materials, other than these pencils, which are pretty good, I think. Polychromos are pretty good pencils. There was a time when they were considered to be probably the best colored pencils out there. That's probably not the case anymore. There are more expensive, higher quality brands, but I'm not really up to date on these things. I just have these. They work for me. And if you have some others, I guess you can just try to, and if you want to do something similar to what I did, you can just try to approximate in terms of colors. You can just try to use similar colors, because obviously different brands have a different range of colors. So I did the robe here, and I did that using a combination of several colors, mostly a dark olive green and black for the shadow areas and the midtones, and of course I used an ivory colored pencil in combination with that olive green for the lighter part of the robe, because the left side of it is facing towards the light source, and of course it's going to be a lot lighter. So I'm back to working on the face a little bit, adding some details, trying to define some of these lighter portions of the drawing a bit better. But there's still a lot of work to be done around the nose, and of course I haven't even started on the other eye yet. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge, because normally it's a better idea to work on the eyes all at once, as it were, or one right after the other. But I kind of went around the eye on the right here, which is something that I often do. I don't really know why, but I just sometimes start working from details, and then I kind of gravitate towards the larger areas. So there's a part of me that wants to work on the details, probably because of the impatience, and then there's the other sensible part probably that wants to establish the larger areas of shadow first, and to establish those larger contrasts first, which is probably a good idea, and then move on from to the details from there. The character of Sam Gamgee is one of the most likable characters in the book and in the movies as well, and I thought that the actor was a pretty good choice, although the casting in the movie was very good for all of the characters. Now I'm having some minor difficulties with the positioning of the pupils, which made my portrait look a little bit cross-eyed there for a second, but I'm going to fix it by shading the corners of the eyes, and that's probably going to get a little bit better. The eyes are still a little bit asymmetrical, but one of the tricks that I like to use to fix those things is to look at my own portrait in a mirror, and that kind of helps me immediately spot some of the distortions and asymmetry that I might have created. Because when you keep looking at the portrait that you're working on, sometimes it's very difficult to see where the problems are. So when you look at it in a mirror, you can immediately see some of the problems. And this is a technique that I highly recommend. Now, one of the things that I also decided to fix was the overall shape of the head. Obviously my sketch was not perfect, and I needed to make the hair a little bit larger and a little bit messier. So I think it looks a bit better now. I also added quite a few of those flyaway hairs, which I think makes the hair look a lot more realistic. Now, for those flyaway hairs, for the lighter hairs, especially at the top and on the left side, I used that light peach color. I don't know if it's called light peach, that's how I'm describing it, because it's a Staedtler pencil. I didn't have a Faber-Castell equivalent. And I also used an ivory colored pencil for the lightest ones. So the ivory colored pencil is kind of like a yellowish white, but it's a very light color. And here I fixed the nose a little bit because it was a bit too wide and too flat, and the right side of it needed to be a bit darker, so I shaded that additionally, and I think the nose is starting to look a little bit more realistic and a little bit better. And I did the same thing with the right side of the mouth, the cheeks, and some other areas. I also realized that the left portion of the cheek needed to be just a little bit darker as well. And then, once I was mostly happy with how I shaded the face, I decided to move on to the right side of the background, because if I do a little bit more of the background on the right, that's going to make it easier for me to draw the hair on the right as well, because when I have the background, it's going to be easier for me to establish the contrast between the hair and the background, and also to gauge what colors and the amount of value I need for the hair on the right side. But as you can see, a lot of hair still needs to be done, because there are some areas which still appear kind of dull and grayish and messy. So there are some ugly stages during every pencil drawing, but this is especially the case when you're working with colors, I think. As you can see, as I'm making my progress, more and more of my drawing is starting to look better. It's starting to look as it's supposed to. Now this right side of the head and the hair here is going to be a lot darker, but the background is also going to be darker as well. And I'm using a Tortillon and brushes again to blend that in. Like I said, most of the time I prefer brushes, but Tortillons also have their advantages. So for this darker side of the head, I also added some greenish tones. I thought that they would complement the tones on the light side of the face pretty well, and they will also integrate well into the setting, into the environment, because of the lights in the background. I'm gonna add a few more of those here in the background on the right side as well. So basically I draw the lighter part first, and then I work around it with some slightly darker colors, and then I blend everything in, usually with brushes, and I try to remove the texture so that the background would look blurry and out of focus. It's important for the background to look blurry, it's important for it to be out of focus, because if the lines and the texture remain visible, it's going to be too distracting. It's going to take the focus away from the main subject. Now, I've established a nice contrast between the lighter portions of the hair on the left and the dark ones on the right, but I still need to define the shape and the structure a little bit better. So I need to break that hair into smaller segments and give it a little bit more texture. But during that process, I'm going to be using some of the colors that I used for the lighter side of the hair. But here in this part, the dark part of the head, I'm going to be using them a bit more sparingly. And I'm going to have to be careful that these, how should I put them, lighter portions in the shadow area should still remain darker than the highlights in the light area, because the shadow side is darker than the light side, obviously, and even the highlights in the shadow side are going to be darker than the ones on the left. But here and there you're just going to have a few of those segments, or maybe a few hairs, which will kind of be sticking out and getting more light from the light source. So it's okay to have a few of those which are lighter. But generally, the shadow side of the head needs to be darker overall. Because if you fail to do that, then all the texture you do on your hair will not be worth much, because you will fail to capture that volume, the overall shape of your subject. I'm just working around the edges a little bit, and then moving on to the background. I'm going to add some greenish and black tones here as well, black colors. Just blending that in. Occasionally I can also use my finger, but I generally try to avoid that when I work on sandpaper, because sandpaper can be a little bit rough on your fingers. You can blend and blend, you can think this is working pretty well, but then eventually your fingers start bleeding because the skin wears thin. So it's better to use blending tools, and those blending tools will be worn down eventually. Here my camera went out of focus a little bit, but I still wanted to show you this segment, so I'm sorry about the quality. It's going to refocus soon enough. In this part here I started working on the rest of his clothes. This string that holds the robe, and the vest that he's wearing under the robe. Some of the lighter portions of his shirt, for which I used mostly an ivory colored pencil, and here and there I also used a white colored pencil. So I used a combination of these two. And again, I blended that by using quite a bit of pressure, using tortillons, and then I worked over that a little bit more with an ivory colored pencil. I added some brown colors for the clothes under the robe. In my reference, the clothes had much more complex texture. I couldn't really capture that, or maybe I didn't want to spend so much time working on that, so I simplified that a little bit. You can see me going back to working on the face here and there. If I notice something I don't like, I just make a few adjustments. But it's mostly the clothes now. That's mostly what I need to finish. So this lower right portion of the drawing, and then my portrait will be finished. A button here, and a little bit of shading on it, and a bit more work on the shirt. Drawing these lighter portions when you have a darker sandpaper, darker color sandpaper, can be a little bit tricky. You need to do a bit of blending, and then you may need to apply the pencil again on top of that. But here I don't really care too much, because a lot of it is going to be in the shadow. So for the shadow I also used a bit of grey over the white and ivory, and a bit of black here and there as well. So, as I've already mentioned, I decided to challenge myself and push this technique even further by trying to draw some portraits on this sandpaper using colored pencils. Now, the next drawing in this technique is probably going to be a landscape of some sort again, but I plan to do more portraits and wildlife as well. Just drawing some folds on the shirt, drawing some shadow areas before I move on to the rest of the clothes. So a bit more work here on the shirt, a bit more blending, and then a bit more brown for this vest that he's wearing under the robe, if that is a vest, if that is a vest of some sort, I'm not really sure. I'm going to add a bit of random texture to it. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just want to add some texture just to make that area a little bit more interesting. I don't want to make it too smooth. But I'm not too concerned about that. My main focus was the face, the portrait itself. And I think I did a decent job on the background. I achieved what I wanted to do. I wanted to make it blurry and out of focus, so I never put in too much effort into drawing clothes, or I rarely do so. Just as long as I can capture the overall shape and the amount of value, I'm happy with the way it looks. So I drew some of those darker areas, darker folds around the top of the robe where he has some sort of a hood probably, and I added some lighter color on top of those folds to make them look more three-dimensional. And I also added a bit more of the black in the lower right portion of the drawing to make that a bit darker, to stay consistent with the light source, I guess. Because it wouldn't make much sense if this right side of the body would be as light or as dark as the left one, because the right one obviously needs to be a bit darker. So I just added a bit of black, and then I blended that in using a brush. But these are finishing touches, I believe. And the drawing is almost done. I hope you like it. I hope you like my choice of a subject, and I hope you like this technique. I hope that I wasn't too clumsy with the colors, and that some people will find this useful or entertaining. If you want to see longer videos, you can check out my Patreon, where you can find full-length videos. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I have lots of videos, lots of different techniques, lots of different subjects. Don't forget to give me a like. Don't forget to comment. All of these things mean a lot for my channel. The drawing is done. I'm just going to sign it in the lower right corner. I'm going to use a black colored pencil. I'm not really sure if my signature will be visible, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be too conspicuous anyway. So I hope you liked this one. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.